together to overcome our challenges if we listen to one another, not just those we agree with, by the way, if we value experience equally to passion. I know we can create solutions that will carry Seattle through this decade and into the future.
You're hearing the voice of former police chief Carmen Best as she stepped down from her job 2 years ago. The legacy she leaves behind is a complicated one. It involves 3 unresolved complaints against her that the city is wrestling with to this day. So what's the city council doing to address that issue this week? Plus, what changes are ahead for those permits that allow outdoor dining at restaurants? And what does that mean for our streets and sidewalks? Also, why are some employees saying they'd quit their jobs instead of returning to work downtown? Well, we've got all that and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own, and I'm joined by none other than David Croman, transportation reporter of the Seattle Times. And David, I know you cover a lot of issues in transportation, but I saw you online talking about this. You were a little jealous watching the sports reporters covering Julio Rodriguez down in LA. Man, that was a heck of a performance to watch there.
Yeah, that was fun to watch. I those guys have a hard job because
They do.
they've got a lot of late nights and a lot of travel, and I usually don't envy them. But seeing them kind of milling around in sunny Los Angeles, and that looked kind of nice. I could have done with that.
I know, yeah, the budding of a superstar there for sure. Well, thank you as always, David, for joining me. Thanks to all of our listeners. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Catch them on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our patrons. Callie just joined us as a patron last week. Thank you very much, Callie. Callie is a Mug Club patron, joined us at the $10 level, so we sent her a Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug last week. Callie, make sure you send a photo. We want your mug shot when you can. Thank you very much for your support. Our mug shot of the week this week, a lovely floral arrangement from Cliff. Thank you, Cliff. Great shot there. Thanks for that. Thanks to all of our patrons out there. If you are a listener, please support the show at whatever level you can. That's Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Finally, thanks to Converge Media. The video of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, we're going to get started with right here, right now. Okay, so this week, the City Council will be approving a measure that would set up a clearer process to investigate the chief of police. Why is this important? Here's some background, folks. We all remember the upheaval 2 years ago, a summer full of protests, the chop up on Capitol Hill. From those protests, thousands of misconduct complaints were filed against the SPD, and just about all of them have been resolved, except 3 cases involving the chief of police concerning the use of tear gas, some other orders given during CHOP. So the OPA, the Office of Police Accountability, said at the time, investigating the chief, not in our rule book here. The Office of the Inspector General said it's not in our jurisdiction. At that point, then Mayor Durkin should have, according to Mayor Harrell, sent these cases to an outside investigator. That did not happen. Durkin's office says it was not responsible for that decision, and here we are. So, David, I wanted to make sure I gave that background, but what the council is doing this week is setting up a clearer process for these investigations in the future. One of the big takeaways, though, I get from all of this is that nobody, certainly not the chief or the mayor, wanted any part of the responsibility of what happened at the CHOP.
Yeah, that's true. And, even this morning, there's in my paper, there's more stories about tort claims coming from that CHOP zone. No, I mean, that was a messy situation, obviously. And this is interesting because it does seem like, especially around the CHOP Chaz stuff, there was a lot of kind of buck being passed from one official to the next. We saw this with that kind of pink umbrella incident where initially a frontline person got blamed, and then it was that person's superior who got blamed, and then it's kind of this who actually it was a bad situation in a lot of people's eyes, and so who actually was responsible for that? And I think what has frustrated some people is the perception that the chief of police, who was kind of at the top of all this, seems to have kind of shirked a lot of the responsibility of what happened. The kind of extra layer, though, is unlike anyone else in the police department, the chief of police is at the employed at the whim of the mayor.
That's right.
And so
at the pleasure of the mayor, as it said. Yeah,
at the pleasure of the mayor. Yeah. So in theory, if there was going to be accountability for the chief of police, it would you would think it would come from the mayor, because
Right.
whoever that mayor is can fire the chief of police, and there's
Hmm.
no fear of arbitration or
Right.
unions. It's a very easy thing to do for a mayor to fire a chief of police.
Sure.
But now we're hearing, from Mayor Harrell, who has spent a lot of his first half a year in office kind of blaming Mayor Jenny Durkin for things
For a
in the
lot of
past.
things. Yeah. Hmm.
Sort of arguing that she didn't exercise her oversight as strongly as maybe she could have. And so,
Yeah.
maybe this is where this new legislation is coming in.
Yeah, we'll see. And of course, Mayor Harrell, the former chair of the Public Safety Committee when he served on council, certainly knows a lot about these issues. We're going to talk about his police hiring plan a little bit later on in the show. But just looking at this a little more closely, David. So these three complaints, I should say, against former Chief Best involved the decision to use tear gas after a ban was put in place by the city council. A claim that she also spread misinformation about crime in the CHOP, and also that she lied about a dispatch problem concerning a young man who was shot and killed there. So, looking forward here, Mayor Harrell says he's now sent these complaints to an outside investigator. Do you think we're ever going to get a clearer picture of what happened, or what's going to come out of that investigation?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to do this sort of after she has already left.
Right.
I mean, I don't think I think maybe what we could see is someone coming out and saying, yeah, she screwed up, but that could be kind of the most, maybe. But
Mm.
I wouldn't see, and I suppose there could be some legal liability. I mean, like I kind of mentioned before, there are still lawsuits happening, or threats of lawsuits happening, as
Oh, yeah.
related to the CHOP Chaz.
Hmm.
And so I
Yeah.
suppose if there was an investigator's opinion that the former chief had screwed something up, that could
Right.
maybe make her a little bit more liable in these lawsuits. But
Hmm.
I doubt that this would lead to, you can't fire somebody who's already retired. Um,
Yeah.
I don't think there would be any sort of like criminal charges or anything like that, or even civil
Yeah.
necessarily. So, I don't know. I mean, I think it might be just kind of a way to bring closure to that
Or
whole
try
episode,
to.
which
Yeah.
clearly people don't feel like they have that closure. The fact that we're still talking about this
2 years later. Yeah. No. And
two
thinking
years,
about
more than
that.
2 years later.
Yeah, yeah, and in thinking about this, just what Mayor Harrell is working on right now, I think you bring up a great point about liability here, because what if this investigation comes back with some sort of additional liability pointed at the city? There are a number of merchants up there in CHOP who are very upset about the lack of public safety provided during that period. So certainly more to come with this. We'll be following up on this as it happens, folks. But I did want to follow up on another transportation issue here with you, David. The Transportation Committee this week working on a few issues, including encouraging affordable housing near light rail, setting up overnight truck parking areas, and fines for people parking in public right of ways or rights of way. I always screw that one up in our industrial areas. But the big one I wanted to discuss with you, David, is the Safe Starts Permit Program. This is what allows restaurants and other retailers to set up outdoor dining and merchandising. And you and I touched on this a little while ago, but now we've got the public surveys in on this. There's a lot of support for this program, especially when it comes to outdoor dining, but a few challenges too. And the larger issue I'm seeing coming out of this is, how does a program like Safe Starts impact the pedestrian master plan we've talked about before, the larger comprehensive plan? Because finding that happy medium between something that's good for businesses and customers and doesn't block sidewalks and doesn't take away too much parking, that's not an easy task.
No, and kind of what you got at is why things tend to move kind of slowly in Seattle with the
Yeah.
Seattle process, which is, we can see from the surveys that this is a wildly popular thing. I mean, that support goes down a little bit when, as surveys tend to do, people support things in theory, but when asked, about kind of specific parking or sidewalk impacts, that support goes down a little bit. But for the most
Hmm.
part, I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of the people surveys support having more sidewalk cafes, more pedestrianization of streets, and
Hmm.
that seems fairly clear to me. But then, yeah, the second you start to ask about how does this interact with this, how does what about this constituency, what about this constituency, suddenly the Seattle
Hmm.
process starts to kind of pop its head up.
Yeah.
One thing that was so interesting to me about COVID is that so much of that kind of went away. I mean,
Yep.
I think people have been pushing for, kind of more street pedestrian friendly street cafes in Seattle for a long time, and nothing had really happened. And then suddenly overnight, because of COVID, this just happened, and
Yeah.
it was pretty popular. And yet, like so many issues we've talked about, the challenge now is sort of transitioning from that
Yes.
kind of emergency fast reaction mode into making something like this permanent. But again, I think sure there are challenges, but at the end of the day, when you look at support for this, both in the survey and then just anecdotally talking to basically everybody, it feels like there is broad support for having these kind of outdoor cafes and creating a street scene that looks more welcoming and friendly to pedestrians.
Yeah, they're talking about a pedestrian clear zone. We'll see what that looks like and how that ends up getting enforced. A few other takeaways here, too. You may see more food trucks in a residential neighborhood near you. The council's working on that option, and I cannot wait for the day, David, when I can chase after that Tex-Mex fusion taco truck and not the ice cream truck. I'm going to be the first in line on that one. But the other part of this, you mentioned with the pandemic here, that's really coming to the fore. Free permit system, basically starting out here in this pilot phase, but the city plans to start charging fees in 2023. So as we hope to get out of pandemic mode, is this going to be viable in the future? Are these different restaurants going to be willing to pay for this? I know in some cases, these different places that they've used for outdoor eating have been used as shelters for people who are homeless. So there's a few different pieces here when you ask people to start paying for this too.
Right. Yes. This reminds me of the kind of kerfuffle we saw in Edmonds, where the city tried to charge, I think it was $5,000 for their street cafes. And having seen Edmonds, it kind of went overnight from having a ton of these on the streets to just a couple of them.
Yeah.
So, if it's kind of an interesting situation, I kind of read it as either the city thinks this is a good idea and is trying to encourage more of them, or they don't. But if they do think that, then I would think charging a bunch of money to set them up is not really going to, they aren't going to have as nearly as many of them if restaurants have to pay for them. So, if they actually if their goal is to encourage more of these kinds of sidewalks, it's curious to me that they're also sort of going to start charging people to do that. If they don't want them, then maybe they should just say they don't want them.
Yeah. Gonna be a fine line there. I know equity is a big part of this discussion too, and making sure a number of these different restaurants can access this type of idea. The safe starts with the cafes that happen outside. All right. Well, more to come on that, I know, as the Transportation Committee looks at that and the full council too. But coming up, you heard about the mayor's plan to hire more officers. We're going to break it down on Now Hear This. Well, Mayor Bruce Harrell has a new hiring plan for police officers, unveiled last week, under consideration by the city council right now. That plan would offer financial incentives, $30,000 for lateral transfers, cops coming from other departments, $7,500 for new recruits, in the effort to bring the number of sworn officers up to about 1,450 from the current 30-year low of 954. So the mayor says he's trying to hire the right officers too, those who can build public trust. And he said these words directly during his press conferences to officers themselves.
Number one, I respect what you do. You're trying to protect and serve. I'm trying to find you bench strength. And I'm trying to change the narrative to unify this city. A city that's been fragmented in recent years, but whose trajectory is only going to be improved by what we're trying to do in the Harrell administration.
Well, David, my big question first on this, if Harrell's plan is approved as if, and that's a big if for the city council, we'll get to that in a second, but if it is approved, would it work? What do you think?
I don't know. None of, at least as far as I can tell, there's not a lot in here that hasn't really already been discussed and in some respects tried before. The recruiting, the signing bonus is a little higher now at $30,000
for lateral officers.
Is what he's proposing, which really shows just how highly valuable lateral officers are. But as we've talked about before, a lot of places now have these signing bonuses, so it's a bit of an arms race. So if you're an officer looking to move departments, you can kind of take your pick, and you're probably going to be able to get these kinds of benefits. And then he also has talked about kind of modernizing recruiting forms and basically talked about hiring a PR firm and making the whole thing look slick. But
Mm-hmm.
whether or not that would work, I don't know. I mean, my sense is that there was something kind of more. There's a kind of deeper disconnect here than some PR marketing firms could
Yeah.
close. And
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there's a bit of a cultural disconnect between people in Seattle and the people who work in the Seattle Police Department. And we've heard this kind of on both ends of the spectrum here. So
Right.
whether it'll work, I don't know. I mean, it is a lot of money to try and get new people to transfer. And I don't know that it fixes really kind of what the underlying problem here is, which is a lot of people leaving in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll be curious. I think this is still kind of under discussion, and under negotiation, what they might offer to people who are there already as sort of retention bonuses, but that isn't on the table just right now. And so, you can recruit 40 officers, that's fine. But if 100 leave, then you're still in the negative.
Right, right. And the chief has talked about that idea of retention bonuses, but he's keeping it a little bit under his vest there just because it is part of a current negotiation with SPOG, the Police Officers Guild, which has yet to sign a contract, hasn't had one for several years now. I wanted to talk about the dollars and cents here, David, because it looks like this proposal at $2 million is about double what the city council was talking about when it came around to recruiting and retention efforts. The council working on this a little while ago. So the mayor said he wanted this slicker setup here. I'm just trying to figure out if the council is going to buy in on this, because Councilmember Herbold, who heads up the Public Safety Committee, said in a statement last week she supports hiring more police. The council has fully funded the SPD's staffing plans over the past few years, but she also says we need to see investments into alternative responses. And she's framing it as this: we're falling behind on this plan to create police alternatives, and that's what's leading to impacts on community and the SPD getting stretched too thin. I just wanted to bring this up, David. What do you think the council is going to do with the mayor's plan?
It's interesting. I mean, we've the council has recently clearly shown more of an appetite for these kinds of recruiting efforts than they had maybe in late 2020.
Right.
And the fact that Councilmember Herbold is out there saying she kind of in principle supports new recruitment, that and we have Councilmember Peterson and Nelson and Juarez, who are always kind of more skeptical of the defund conversation, and then you take in Councilmember Lewis and maybe Councilmember Strauss, and suddenly you've got possibly a majority towards supporting some of these recruitment efforts. But as Councilmember Herbold has pointed out, there was a lot of talk about finding alternatives to policing, and sort of specific talk. I mean, she did a press conference with Mayor Durkin saying
end of last year,
trying to launch this Triage 1 program where they predicted they could get 12% of police calls sort of diverted somewhere else.
Yeah,
and
like the welfare checks and mental health checks, things of this nature. Yeah, keep going. And
that hasn't happened. So it's right now there's sort of two promises that City Hall is falling short on both ends, which is they're not retaining police officers and recruiting enough police officers, and then also simultaneously are not creating those kinds of alternatives that they had talked about in the first place. Yeah. So it's kind of in a limbo period here that it's hard to see how it serves anybody's kind of interests immediately.
Yeah. Right. And I know Mayor Harrell is really framing this as, hey, we've got a crisis here when it comes to officers. We got to respond to that first, get the Band-Aid put on there, and then we'll talk about the alternative piece. But I think the council really pushing for both at once. I will say, though, Mayor Harrell is pushing for this one Seattle approach. He's talked about that a lot, certainly the theme of his mayorship so far. I know that Mayor Durkin last year pushed it through with an executive order, didn't get the council's permission when it came to getting these hiring bonuses in place. I get the feeling, though, that the mayor is willing to work a little bit more with the council to try to come up with a plan that they both agree with. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I do think, and this could fall apart at any time. It's still relatively early in Mayor Harrell's term, but I do think in general that's true. I think I get the sense from the council that they feel like they have a better relationship with this mayor and this mayor's office than they did with the last one. I'm sure the fact that Bruce Harrell was a council member had something to do with that. So he kind of understands that relationship. So yeah, I do think that it's notable that he's doing this through a legislative process rather than executive. And to his credit, that is sort of what he ran on, which was
Mm-hmm.
a more collaborative city hall. And it would be
Yeah.
easy to say that on the campaign trail and then just start issuing executive orders. And
Right.
but he is taking the legislative route, at least in
Yeah.
this occasion.
Yeah. We'll see what happens with that. Thanks for the breakdown on that piece, David. And I wanted to talk about another sort of recruitment retention issue, if you will. City workers who are saying, hey, what's with the push to have us back in person downtown? There was a headline in the Times from your colleagues, Paul Roberts and Sarah Grace Taylor, that said some city workers are ready to quit rather than return to the office. Those workers are saying this isn't about productivity. This is about trying to boost the number of people downtown as we get out of the pandemic, numbers which are not significantly rising right now. So the union representing these workers, Protect 17, says a survey of its workers shows 23% would consider separating from the city due to these return to office plans. I just wanted to get your read here. Is this a negotiation tactic, or what do you think is going to come out of this plan from the mayor to have workers back on the job downtown at least 2 days a week?
Yeah, it could be a negotiation plan. I mean, you wouldn't be any union worth its salt
Has
understands
better
when
do
there's
it, right?
when there's a bit of leverage here, and certainly the city has. I think that they do have some leverage here, just in the same way that basically all the workers have leverage right now, which is they understand that it's really hard to hire people right now, and especially into the public sector. And so the city can ill afford to lose a bunch of public sector workers. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think I don't think this is unique to the city of Seattle's workers. I think we're seeing this in a lot of places that
Right.
the kind of uh, I mean, it's harder for employers to make the argument that people can't do their jobs from home because we've been doing
Yes.
that for the last few years. And so I think in this industry, and then in a lot of industries, we've heard stories about workers quitting rather than being forced to return to the office.
Mm-hmm.
So it really doesn't surprise me at all. The kind of argument about this actually just being Trojan horse way to boost downtown is interesting,
Mm-hmm.
because in some ways it is, the mayor's job to bring back vitality to the city of Seattle. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't doubt that bringing office workers downtown is sort of part of that.
Right.
But if
Right.
you're a union member working for the city, that's not really your concern. Your concern is working conditions. So yeah,
Right.
it's an interesting standoff, and one that I think is not necessarily unique just to the city of Seattle.
Yeah.
I think this is something we're seeing on repeat in basically every industry everywhere.
Oh, yeah, and specifically downtown, I'm looking at those workplace numbers, and the latest I've seen is the number of downtown workers in downtown Seattle is averaging about a third of what it was before the pandemic. So there's a lot of different industries that are dealing with this, and I'm not quite sure if they're going to be able to pull these city workers back in, but I just wonder if those workplace numbers are ever going to rebound because you've got the workers saying, hey, look at productivity levels. They're looking fine here with me working from home. So what's the big push here? And do we need to jump back into traffic and whatever else? I think there's a lot of back and forth between employers and employees right now when it comes to this. And I'm just wondering if those numbers are ever going to come back up. It's a big question for downtown.
Yeah, the Downtown Seattle Association a couple months ago had told me, and then also Paul Roberts, my
Yeah.
colleague, that they thought, I think it was by the end of the summer, they thought they could have 70% back to the office, which
Wow.
even at the time felt way too optimistic, and now
Hmm.
feels frankly like a total pipe dream, because
Yeah.
I think BA5 of course has complicated that, that people still have this fear of getting infected. I mean, I'm certainly going into the office less often just because I'm not worried about my long-term health, but I certainly,
Mhm.
if I can avoid getting COVID, I'd like to
Oh,
not.
yeah.
And so
Hmm.
I'm going to the office less often as a result of that. But I think more than that, there's this sense of flexibility and freedom, and childcare costs a lot, and housing costs
Hmm.
a lot, and people have moved to places where they can afford housing. And I do think that people have fundamentally kind of shifted their lives around remote work, because it's just frankly expensive to go into the office every day, and time consuming, both in time and money. And I'm getting to the point where I don't know that we would ever see 70% of what
Yeah.
we had go back to office. I don't know what the scenario would be. I haven't heard a super clear and convincing
Okay.
argument for why this will ever change, frankly.
Yeah. Wow. That's important to look at. And I know the Downtown Seattle Association and the city is going to be looking on that in the months ahead. But thank you for that, David. All right. Up next, what really happened behind the scenes to lead to more than 200,000 parking tickets getting voided or refunded by the city of Seattle? David's got the scoop on Transportation Talk. Well, David, you recently followed up on a story you reported on in June about the city canceling hundreds of thousands of parking tickets handed out between September of last year and April of this year. What fell apart here?
A few things. The kind of first was, so this transition was of parking enforcement was happening from the Seattle Police Department to Seattle Department of Transportation. And
Right.
it was kind of the most concrete, quote, defund the police effort, even though these jobs weren't going away. It was it was representing a fairly significant reduction of the Seattle Police Department by moving these people into the Seattle Department of Transportation. But when those people moved from the SPD, there was some question about whether they would actually have the authority to still write parking enforcement, and so it was concluded that they would need this kind of special certification from the chief of police. But the timing of this got really screwed up because for one, the chief of police was getting legal advice that maybe new state legislation was going to complicate his ability to write these authorizations in the first place. And so there was a long period of time where the legal counsel was researching this question, while meanwhile these parking enforcement have already left the police department.
Yeah.
And then the other one was this kind of question about whether they could kind of basically tread water for a little while and use status quo while they had transferred to Seattle Department of Transportation. And so there just was not a lot of urgency, it turned out, to get these certifications. And so months went by and they were never signed. And then the mayor's office concluded that therefore meant that these parking enforcement officers never technically had the authority to write these parking tickets. And it's going to turn out to be a $10 million plus.
Right. Not something you want to hear about during a budget gap year, that's for sure. I just wonder what happens next. And you had mentioned, too, potentially there could be more fallout from this, maybe class action suits in the future. What's next on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, if you do believe the logic that these parking enforcement officers never had the authority to write these tickets, then it follows, well, what about towing that happened as a result of a citation that was written? There's one towing company, Lincoln Towing, that does most of the city's towing. And the president of that organization made a kind of funny point to me, which is what he called the John Lennon's guitar argument, which is that if your car is towed and then auctioned off, what's stopping people from, arguing that they had John Lennon's original guitar in the back of their car that they have lost, and therefore the city owes them $10 million or whatever it might be. And we haven't seen a ton of complaints like that roll in yet, but it doesn't. I do think that the city, at least right now, is legally a little vulnerable on some of this stuff because, again, if the citations were illegitimate to begin with, what is the argument that the towing was somehow legitimate as a result? It's sort of, I don't see the connection there. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was more fallout from this.
Wow. Well, we'll see what happens next with that one. Thank you for that breakdown in the Seattle Times there, David. I wanted to wrap up with you and talk about something you wrote online that really resonated with me. What is it about eating cherries this time of year where I won't even look at the price tag? I'm just going to buy them. And those prices are definitely up. But talk to me about this, man. It's all about the cherries in the summertime.
Yeah, there's just nothing. I mean, we're fortunate to live in a state that produces such abundant and delicious cherries. And also, I think for a lot of reasons, they seem to cost like an arm and a leg. So
it's like 52% up, I think I saw. It's crazy.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that actual number, but I definitely we spent $10 on what could be described as like a few handfuls of cherries. But you know what? I don't. I probably buy like 4 bags of cherries a year, and you gotta, if of all the indulgences I could have, I think cherries are a pretty healthy one.
I'm gonna let you have that one. That sounds good. And
Yeah.
dang, that cold April we had. We've got the lowest cherry crop in about a decade, from what I hear. I want to help out those farmers too. So, David, thank you as always for breaking it all down with me. Thanks to everybody listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is available on all the major platforms. And once again, if you are a listener, please do support the show on Patreon. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching on Converge Media too. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.